Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The stretch of highway seemed endless, the kind of road where the landscape blurs into monotony. I had been driving for hours, the drone of the engine a constant companion. My body ached from sitting, and my eyes were heavy with fatigue. When I saw the sign for a rest stop up ahead, it felt like a lifeline. The stop wasn't much, a small diner with peeling paint, a convenience store with faded signage, and a lot that could hold maybe 10 cars at most. It was quiet, almost too quiet, with just a few vehicles scattered around. I pulled into a spot near the edge of the lot, turned off the engine, and stretched as I stepped out. Inside the diner, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried food. A few tired travelers sat at booths, their conversations low and murmured. I ordered a cup of coffee, downed it quickly, and grabbed a snack from the convenience store before heading back to the lot. But when I returned to where I had parked, my car was gone. At first, I thought I had made a mistake. I circled the lot, scanning each space, but it wasn't there. The spot where I had parked was empty, the faint outline of tire tracks the only evidence that a car had been there at all. My pulse quickened as the reality sank in. My car had vanished. Panic set in as I ran back inside the diner. The cashier, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, looked up as I approached. "My car's gone," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "Did you see anything? Anyone take it?" He frowned, shaking his head. "Didn't see a thing. Cars go missing now and then out here, though. Happens more often than you'd think." His response sent a chill down my spine. "Is there someone I can call? The police?" He shrugged. "You could, but they don't usually get far with stuff like this. If you really want to find it, there's a place nearby where people sometimes end up finding their missing cars." "What kind of place?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Old lot, out past the edge of town," he said, lowering his voice. "Folks say it's where stolen cars end up, but I wouldn't go there unless you're desperate." I was desperate. With no better options, I thanked him and asked for directions. He scribbled a crude map on the back of a napkin, his expression grim. "Be careful," he said as I walked out. "That place, it's not right." The directions led me down a narrow, overgrown road that seemed forgotten by time. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. Trees lined the path, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of the highway faded into silence. I began to question my decision. Every instinct told me to turn back, but the thought of losing my car, my lifeline on this trip, kept me moving forward. The road eventually opened into a clearing, and that's when I saw it. The lot was a sprawling graveyard of cars. Vehicles of every make and model were scattered haphazardly, some rusted and broken, others looking eerily untouched. The sight was surreal, like a scene from a dream or a nightmare. I parked my borrowed ride near the edge and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet the only sound. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and decay. As I moved deeper into the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My breath caught when I saw it. Parked near the center of the lot, partially obscured by a cluster of other vehicles, was my car. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. Two figures stood nearby, their backs turned to me. They were dressed in dark clothes, their movements slow and deliberate as they inspected another vehicle. I ducked behind a rusted sedan, my pulse racing. The strangers seemed oblivious to my presence, but I didn't dare move closer. I watched as one of them opened a car door and rummaged through the interior, pulling out something I couldn't see. The other figure gestured toward my car, speaking in a low voice that I couldn't make out. My stomach twisted with unease. They weren't just loitering, they were looking for something. I waited, frozen, as they continued their search. Minutes felt like hours before they finally moved on, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the lot. I stayed hidden, my body tense, until I was certain they were gone. I remained crouched behind the rusted sedan, straining to hear any sign of the strangers returning. My breath was shallow, my ears tuned to the faintest noise. The lot was eerily silent now, the distant chirp of crickets the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. My eyes darted to my car, parked just a few yards away. The strangers had moved on, disappearing into the deeper shadows of the lot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still nearby. The thought of being caught by them, of what they might do if they found me, kept me rooted in place. I debated my next move, weighing the risk of waiting against the fear of being seen. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching endlessly as I huddled in the dark. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek over the hood of the car that sheltered me. The lot was empty, or at least it seemed that way. The strangers were nowhere in sight, and the area around my car appeared clear. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step forward, then another. The gravel beneath my feet crunched loudly, and I winced at the sound, glancing around nervously. I reached my car and froze. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and the interior light cast a faint glow onto the ground. My stomach churned. Someone had been inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave the car and run, but the thought of abandoning it, of being stranded here, pushed me forward. I pulled the door open slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked. The interior looked untouched at first glance, but as I slid into the driver's seat, I noticed small, unsettling details. The seat had been pushed back slightly, as if someone taller than me had adjusted it. The faint scent of cigarette smoke lingered in the air, something I knew hadn't been there before. I reached for the keys, which I'd left hidden in the glove compartment, and felt a pang of relief when they were still there. My hands trembled as I inserted the key into the ignition, half expecting the engine not to start. It roared to life, the sound echoing loudly in the stillness. I glanced around the lot, my headlights sweeping across the rows of abandoned cars. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between vehicles, but it was gone before I could be sure. Panic surged through me. I shifted into reverse, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel as I backed out. My headlights caught the edge of something etched into the hood of a nearby car, a strange symbol, jagged and angular, that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't linger to examine it. I drove toward the exit, my foot pressing hard on the gas. The relief of leaving the lot was fleeting. The narrow road back to the highway felt darker now, the trees on either side casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the car. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or the silhouettes of figures chasing me. The car felt different. The steering wheel was slicker than I remembered, and the faint smell of smoke clung to the upholstery. I turned on the radio to drown out my nerves, but it crackled with static, the signal lost in the isolation of the road. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the back seat. My heart skipped a beat, and I gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes flicking to the mirror. The seat was empty, but the sound persisted, a soft rustling like fabric shifting. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe something had fallen out of the glove compartment or shifted in the trunk. But the noise grew louder, more distinct, until it sounded like breathing. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine and twisted around to inspect the back seat. Nothing. The seat was empty, and the noise had stopped. I exhaled shakily, convincing myself it was just my imagination. As I reached for the ignition, something caught my eye. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the crease of the passenger seat. I hadn't put it there. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 4 words: "Don't come back here." I froze, my breath hitching as a wave of cold fear washed over me. My gaze darted to the rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw a shadow move at the edge of the trees. The headlights from an approaching car broke my focus, and when I looked back, the shadow was gone. I started the engine and drove, not stopping until I reached a crowded truck stop miles down the highway. The house stood at the end of a narrow, winding road, its white siding gleaming in the afternoon sun. It looked like something out of a brochure, spacious, surrounded by trees, and with just the right amount of rustic charm. For a group of weary travelers, it seemed perfect. We'd planned this trip for months, a much-needed getaway from the chaos of our lives. The house was large enough to accommodate all of us, with a cozy living room, a fully stocked kitchen, and more bedrooms than we needed. The host had left a welcome note on the counter along with a basket of snacks, adding to the warm, inviting atmosphere. As we toured the house, one thing stood out, a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Unlike the others, it was locked. One of us tried the handle, only to find it wouldn't budge. That's the storage room the host had mentioned during the booking call. It's off limits, but you'll have everything you need in the rest of the house. At the time, we thought nothing of it. Every rental had its quirks, right? With our bags unpacked and dinner plans underway, the locked door became little more than a footnote in an otherwise idyllic setting. That first night, the house felt alive in the way all unfamiliar places do. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls settling seemed louder in the stillness. We laughed it off, chalking it up to the house's age. But as the hours crept toward midnight, a sound from upstairs caught my attention. It was faint, just a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps pacing back and forth. At first I thought one of the others was moving around, but when I peeked into the hallway, it was empty. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the locked door. I mentioned it the next morning over coffee, expecting laughter or dismissal. Instead, a few of the others nodded uneasily. I heard it too, one of them admitted, like someone walking back and forth. Another joked, maybe it's the ghost of whoever lived here before, but the uneasy tone in their voice betrayed them. We all laughed, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. That day we noticed other oddities. Scuff marks on the floor near the locked door, faint as though someone had dragged something heavy. A draft that seemed to seep from under the door, carrying with it a faint, musty smell. The locked room wasn't just a storage area. Something about it felt wrong. The noises continued over the next few nights. What had been faint creaks and thuds became more pronounced, muffled whispers, a soft tapping that sometimes lasted for minutes at a time. The more we tried to ignore it, the harder it became. One night, curiosity got the better of us. We gathered in the hallway, a mix of apprehension and excitement hanging in the air. One of us pressed an ear to the door, holding up a hand for silence. "Do you hear that?" they whispered. We leaned closer, straining to listen. At first, it was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. My stomach tightened as I pulled away. "It's probably just the wind," I said, more to convince myself than the others. We tried to pick the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, we gave up and went back to the living room, but the tension lingered. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't going to let us forget it was there. It was during a storm 2 nights later that everything changed. The power went out just after sunset, plunging the house into darkness. Armed with flashlights, we gathered in the living room, trying to make the best of it. One of us decided to rummage through the kitchen drawers, hoping to find candles or matches. That's when they found the key. It was small and tarnished, tucked into the corner of a drawer that hadn't been used in years. At first, we weren't sure what it was for, but the shape was unmistakable. "Do you think it's for the door?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. No one wanted to say it, but we all knew the answer. We climbed the stairs as a group, the beam of the flashlight trembling as it illuminated the locked door. My hand shook as I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The sound of the bolt sliding back echoed in the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. The room beyond was small and cramped, lit only by the faint glow of our flashlights. At first it looked empty, but as we stepped inside, the details came into focus. Stacks of photographs were scattered across a desk, their images warped and discolored with age. Symbols had been scrawled onto the walls, their jagged lines carved deep into the plaster. And then there were the objects, an old journal, its pages filled with indecipherable writing, a bundle of what looked like human hair tied with twine, and a small wooden box that rattled ominously when one of us lifted it. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. None of us spoke as we looked around, the weight of the discovery pressing down on us. Whatever this room had been used for, it wasn't storage. It was something darker. We left the room quickly, our nerves frayed and minds racing. Back in the living room, we sat in tense silence, the unease thick in the air. The objects we'd seen, the symbols carved into the walls, they weren't just strange, they felt wrong. as though they carried some dark weight we couldn't fully comprehend. "I think we should leave," someone finally said, breaking the silence. Their voice was trembling, barely masking their fear. Others nodded in agreement, but a few hesitated. It was late, the storm still raging outside. The idea of driving in such conditions seemed reckless, even if staying felt unbearable. We tried to distract ourselves, talking about mundane things, but the conversation always looped back to the room. Who had locked it? Why was the key hidden? And most pressing of all, what had been going on in there? Then the noises started again. This time they weren't confined to the locked room. A thud echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of glass shattering. We rushed to check, only to find nothing out of place. Back in the living room, one of us swore they saw a shadow move across the wall, though there was no one there to cast it. The house felt alive now, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing hour. One of us had taken the journal from the locked room, unable to resist the lure of answers. They sat hunched over it at the dining table, their face pale as they flipped through its pages. The writing was erratic, scrawled in a language or symbols none of us recognized, but a few sections were in English. "What does it say?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. It's about the house," they replied, their hands trembling. "About people who stayed here before, things happening to them, disappearances." They read aloud, their voice faltering as they spoke of rituals performed in the house, of whispers in the walls and shadows that moved on their own. The words painted a grim picture of a history steeped in darkness, of something that lingered long after the rituals ended. The photographs, too, told a story. Many of them depicted the house, but not as we knew it. The images were old, the house's exterior weathered and overgrown. Some showed people, groups of them gathered in the woods nearby or standing in the very room we had unlocked. Their faces were blurred, their expressions unreadable. And then there were the last few photographs. They showed the living room, the kitchen, and the upstairs hallway, all as they looked now. The final image was of us, sitting in the living room, our faces frozen in shock. That was it. We couldn't stay. The storm no longer mattered, nor did the late hour. We packed quickly, throwing clothes and belongings into bags with trembling hands. Every sound the house made felt amplified, the groan of the wind against the windows, the creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. As we gathered in the foyer, preparing to leave, the shadows in the hallway seemed to shift. One of us swore they heard a whisper, soft and faint but unmistakable. "Go," it said, though none of us could be sure if it was real or imagined. We raced to the cars, the rain soaking us to the bone as we flung open doors and slammed them shut. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the house one last time. For a moment, we thought we saw movement in one of the upstairs windows, a figure watching us leave. But when we blinked, it was gone. We didn't look back as we drove away. The abandoned neighborhood had an allure I couldn't resist. I'd passed it dozens of times on the way to work, a sprawling collection of empty houses and cracked streets, slowly being reclaimed by nature. No one seemed to talk about it, as though it had always been there, a forgotten corner of the city no one dared to mention. On a whim, I decided to explore. The air felt different as I stepped into the neighborhood, heavy with stillness. Houses with boarded-up windows and sagging roofs lined the streets, their yards choked with weeds. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my feet. One building stood out among the others, a tall structure, oddly out of place with its clean lines and stark appearance. Unlike the crumbling homes around it, this one seemed untouched by time, its surface smooth and unmarked. A single door at the base beckoned, slightly ajar, as though waiting for me. Curiosity tugged at me. It felt foolish, even reckless, but something about the building called to me. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. The dim light from the open door cast long shadows across the floor, illuminating walls covered in peeling wallpaper and strange markings. Some were graffiti, cryptic symbols scrawled in black paint, while others looked like scratches, deep gouges etched into the plaster. The layout seemed straightforward at first, a long hallway lined with doors. I chose one at random, stepping into what appeared to be a small, empty room. A dusty chair sat in the corner, its wooden legs unevenly balanced on the floor. An old clock hung crooked on the wall, its face blank but still ticking softly. I tried the next door, then another, moving deeper into the structure. The farther I went, the stranger it became. The rooms seemed to loop back on themselves, hallways merging into others without warning. At one point, I returned to the first room, only to find the chair overturned and the clock missing. I told myself it was my imagination. The building was old, the layout confusing, but a knot of unease began to form in my stomach as I realized I had no idea how to get back to the entrance. The exit was gone. I retraced my steps, or at least I thought I did, but the front door wasn't where it had been. Instead, I found myself in another hallway, longer and darker than the one before. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak against the encroaching shadows. The rooms became stranger. One had a single shoe sitting in the middle of the floor, its laces tied neatly. Another held a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. When I stepped inside, my reflection lagged behind my movements, as though caught in some invisible delay. Panic began to set in. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself that there had to be a way out, but every door I opened led to more confusion. Windows were blackened, showing nothing but void. The air grew colder, each breath visible as a faint cloud in the dim light. And then I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. The footsteps weren't mine. That much I knew. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped. My heart pounded as I turned slowly, shining my flashlight down the hallway. Nothing. Just the same empty stretch of wall and doorways. I moved cautiously, my steps lighter now, but the sense of being watched grew with every turn. In one room, I found a set of footprints in the dust leading to a wall where they stopped abruptly. In another, a clock hung on the wall, its hands spinning wildly in opposite directions. The building seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Doors appeared where there had been none before. Hallways grew shorter or longer depending on my direction. I tested one theory, leaving my flashlight behind in a room and walking away, counting my steps. When I turned back, the flashlight was gone. The noises became more distinct, a faint scraping, the whisper of fabric against wood. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall, though there was nothing there to cast it. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone, but the signal was gone. I was alone, or at least I hoped I was. Desperation gripped me as I searched for a way out. My breathing was shallow, and my flashlight flickered weakly in the oppressive darkness. The footsteps were back, echoing faintly, always just out of reach. It was as though someone or something was deliberately keeping its distance, taunting me with its presence. I tried to reason with myself. This was just an old building, a trick of acoustics, a maze of twisting hallways designed to confuse. But the rational thoughts were drowned out by a deeper, primal fear. Then a faint breeze brushed against my face. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A shift in the stagnant air that carried the faintest scent of the outside world. I latched onto it like a lifeline and began to follow it, navigating the corridors by instinct alone. The building fought back. Hallways stretched longer than they had before, and doors that should have opened swung into solid walls. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. I pressed forward, guided only by the faint breath of air that whispered through the oppressive stillness. At last I stumbled into a familiar hallway. The front door stood at the far end, wide open, light spilling in from the outside. My heart surged with hope, and I bolted toward it, not daring to look back. I burst into the cool night air, collapsing onto the cracked pavement outside. The building loomed behind me, silent and unyielding, as though it had never tried to trap me at all. Night had fallen, the world beyond the building cloaked in shadows. The neighborhood, which had seemed merely abandoned before, now felt hostile, as though it resented my presence. Streetlights flickered erratically, casting strange, distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt. I tried to get my bearings, but the streets looked different in the dark. Houses that had appeared empty now seemed alive with faint movements behind broken windows. The air was colder, sharper, carrying an eerie stillness that set my teeth on edge. Then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, standing at the far end of the street. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I turned down another street, quickening my pace. When I glanced back, the shadowy figure was still there, closer now, standing beneath a flickering streetlight. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't following me in the conventional sense. It was appearing, vanishing from one spot and reappearing in another, always at the edges of my vision. I broke into a run, the cracked pavement uneven beneath my feet. My lungs burned with effort, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than the pain. Every corner I turned, every alley I darted into, the figure was there unmoving, its presence oppressive and unrelenting. The neighborhood became a maze in its own right, the once familiar streets twisting into unfamiliar patterns. I passed the same boarded-up house twice, its front door slightly ajar the second time. My own footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the sound was being mimicked by something unseen. The figure grew bolder, its form more distinct as it began to close the distance. I could make out faint details now, a dark silhouette, featureless but unnaturally tall, its limbs too long and thin. My heart raced as I spotted the faint glow of streetlights ahead, marking the edge of the neighborhood. I poured every ounce of strength into my legs, sprinting toward the light. The figure didn't follow this time. It simply stood still, watching me flee. I crossed the boundary of the neighborhood, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a weight off my chest. I turned back, half expecting to see the figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. At first there was nothing, only the desolate expanse of crumbling houses. The road stretched endlessly ahead, its cracked asphalt illuminated by the weak glow of my headlights. Trees lined both sides, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, and the occasional gust of wind rustled the leaves, breaking the oppressive silence. It was the kind of night where the world felt smaller, contained to the bubble of my car's cabin and the faint hum of the engine. I was midway through a long drive, the hours blending together in the monotony of the empty highway. The isolation was comforting at first, but as the night wore on, it began to feel suffocating. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever when something caught my eye. Up ahead on the shoulder of the road, hazard lights blinked faintly. A car sat motionless, its silhouette barely visible against the dark backdrop of trees. I slowed instinctively, curiosity flaring. Why would someone leave their car here in the middle of nowhere? And where were they? As I pulled over, the uneasy quiet returned, heavier now. The blinking lights seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment I considered driving on, but my curiosity outweighed the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I stepped out of my car, the cool night air prickling my skin. The abandoned vehicle loomed ahead, its driver's side door slightly ajar. The air around the car was unnaturally still. My footsteps echoed softly as I approached, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes the only sound breaking the silence. I circled the vehicle cautiously, taking in the details. The windows were fogged over, and the paint had scratches, as though it had been driven through thick brush. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air. The driver's side door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dark interior cluttered with belongings. A map was crumpled on the passenger seat, its corners stained and torn. A half-empty water bottle rolled against the gearshift, and the faint scent of old leather and sweat hung in the air. My eyes were drawn to the steering wheel. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as I leaned closer, I realized the dark stain on the wheel wasn't dirt, it was dried blood. My breath hitched as I took a step back, a wave of unease washing over me. What had happened here? And where was the driver? I couldn't leave yet, not without knowing more. Steeling myself, I leaned back into the car, my flashlight sweeping over the interior. The back seat was littered with odd, mismatched items, a child's toy, a tattered blanket, and a duffel bag partially unzipped. The flashlight beam caught something metallic inside the bag, a knife, its blade smeared with what looked like dried blood. My pulse quickened as I zipped the bag shut and turned my attention to the glove compartment. Inside, I found a stack of documents. Papers with strange, cryptic notes scrawled in the margins, and a set of photographs that made my stomach churn. The images were grainy but clear enough to make out the details. A figure stood in each frame, captured in mid-motion, their face blurred as though they were moving too quickly. The same figure appeared in every photograph, always standing in different locations. A parking lot, a forest trail, a deserted highway. I flipped to the last photograph and froze. It showed the road I was on, the abandoned car barely visible in the distance. My car was parked just behind it. A chill ran down my spine as I turned to look behind me. At first, there was nothing. The road was empty, the darkness stretching endlessly in both directions. My flashlight's beam flickered faintly as I scanned the tree line, the unease in my chest growing heavier with each passing second. Then I saw it, a shadow standing at the edge of the road, just barely illuminated by the faint glow of my taillights. My breath caught as I tried to make sense of it. The figure was still, unnaturally so, as though frozen in place. It stood far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. I backed away from the car, my footsteps quick and unsteady. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. My hands fumbled with my keys as I climbed back into my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The shadow remained where it was, silent and watching. Heart pounding, I started the engine, the sound shattering the eerie stillness. The figure still didn't move as I turned the car around and sped down the road, my headlights slicing through the darkness. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. The adrenaline from my escape began to wane as the road stretched endlessly ahead, its twists and turns illuminated only by the weak glow of my headlights. My mind raced, replaying the scene by the abandoned car and the shadowy figure. What had I stumbled into? And more terrifyingly, was it over? A flicker of light in the distance caught my eye. A pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. Relief surged at the thought of another driver, but it was short-lived. The vehicle appeared suddenly, as though it had materialized from the darkness, and it was gaining on me fast. My hands tightened on the wheel as the other car approached, its lights blinding in the mirror. I sped up, but the vehicle matched my pace, tailgating so closely that I could see the outline of its grille. The engine roared as the driver flashed their high beams, the sudden brightness piercing the night. Panic set in. This wasn't a coincidence. Whoever was driving that car wasn't trying to pass, they were following me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the tires screeching as I veered around a bend, desperate to lose them. The pursuing car didn't relent. Its headlights stayed fixed on me, the glare disorienting as I sped down the winding road. The trees on either side blurred into dark streaks, and the narrow shoulders offered no safe place to pull over. I was trapped, the predator and prey dynamic unmistakable. A sharp turn appeared ahead, and I seized the opportunity. I yanked the wheel hard, my car skidding onto a narrow side road. The tires struggled to grip the loose gravel, but I managed to steady the vehicle and press on, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, the world was silent again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting the other car to follow, but the road behind me was empty, the headlights gone. Relief flooded me, but it was tinged with unease. I didn't trust the quiet. Not anymore. The road narrowed further, winding through dense trees that loomed overhead like sentinels. I drove cautiously now, scanning the mirrors constantly. The sense of being watched lingered, as though the shadowy figure from before had never truly left. I finally reached a small rest stop, its flickering neon sign a welcome sight in the oppressive darkness. Pulling into the lot, I parked under the weak glow of a street lamp and turned off the engine, letting the silence envelop me. My hands trembled as I sat there trying to collect myself. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a truck on the highway, felt amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. I glanced around the empty lot, my eyes darting between the shadows. Then I saw it. Sitting in the passenger seat was something I hadn't put there, a single photograph. My stomach dropped as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the worn edges of the paper. The image was of me, standing by the abandoned car. The angle was perfect, as though someone had been watching from the trees. My breath hitched as I scanned the parking lot again. Nothing moved, but the oppressive sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I started the car, the engine's rumble breaking the silence, and drove off without looking back. The rest of the drive was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see headlights or the shadowy figure looming in the distance. But the road remained empty, the oppressive darkness giving way to the faint glow of dawn. The morning air felt crisp as I walked through the doors of my new workplace. The building was a typical corporate labyrinth: gray walls, fluorescent lights, and a hum of quiet productivity. I clutched my onboarding folder like a lifeline, trying to suppress the jitters of being the new hire. My supervisor, Mr. Harrington, was a tall man with an air of authority that made me feel small. After a firm handshake, he led me on a brief tour of the facility. "This here is the main office area," he explained, gesturing to rows of desks populated by people hunched over screens. "Break rooms down that hallway, and restrooms are at the end of the corridor." We passed a heavy, unmarked door, and I instinctively glanced at it. Harrington's tone sharpened. "That's off limits. Company rules. No exceptions." I nodded quickly, not wanting to draw attention to my curiosity. The rest of the tour was uneventful, but the image of that door lingered in my mind. Something about the way Harrington avoided elaborating on it gnawed at me. By the end of the day, I had settled into my desk and completed a mountain of paperwork. But as I glanced around at my coworkers, their expressions were unreadable, almost guarded. I told myself it was just first-day nerves, but a subtle tension seemed to hang in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The days that followed were a mix of routine and unease. My tasks were straightforward: data entry, filing reports, and occasionally running errands to other parts of the building. Yet every time I passed the unmarked door, a wave of curiosity washed over me. Coworkers seemed to avoid even glancing in its direction, as if acknowledging its presence might summon something unwelcome. One afternoon, I overheard snippets of a hushed conversation between two colleagues in the break room. Their voices dropped the moment I entered, and they exchanged a glance before abruptly changing the subject. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed such behavior. Whispers in corners, quick glances over shoulders. It was as if everyone was hiding something. I tried to focus on my work, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Even the air seemed heavier in certain parts of the building, especially near the restricted area. Once, while organizing files in a nearby office, I heard muffled sounds coming from beyond the unmarked door. It could have been machinery or something entirely innocuous, but my instincts told me otherwise. I asked a coworker, Sarah, about it during lunch. She stiffened, her fork pausing midair. "Don't ask about that," she said softly, her tone leaving no room for argument. The look in her eyes was enough to silence me, but my curiosity had already begun to fester. It happened during an unusually chaotic day. Harrington had assigned me to deliver a stack of reports to a storage room on the far side of the building. The directions were vague, and I ended up wandering through unfamiliar hallways. As I turned a corner, I realized I was near the restricted area. The unmarked door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. No one was around. Logic told me to turn back, but something deeper, a gnawing need to understand, pushed me forward. I peeked inside. The room was dimly lit, with rows of filing cabinets and shelves cluttered with boxes. At first it seemed ordinary, but as I stepped further in, I noticed inconsistencies. Some boxes were marked with faded labels that made no sense: experimental and voided. One cabinet had a lock that had been forcibly broken. The air was thick with a musty, almost chemical smell. A sudden noise made me freeze. A faint creak, as if someone was shifting their weight just outside the door. My heart pounded as I realized the door was now closed. Panic set in, and I scrambled to find another exit, but the room was a dead end. I had no choice but to face whoever, or whatever, was on the other side. My hands shook as I pushed the door open slightly, enough to slip back into the hallway. It was empty. I exhaled in relief, but my curiosity hadn't been satisfied. Before I could second-guess myself, I darted back into the room and began exploring in earnest. I opened one of the boxes marked voided and found stacks of old photographs. They depicted people in what looked like experiments, wires attached to their heads, expressions frozen in agony. Another box contained documents with heavily redacted text. I could only make out a few phrases: unauthorized trials, employee disposal, and containment failure. A metallic sound echoed from the hallway, snapping me out of my trance. I hastily replaced the items and slipped out of the room, heart racing. This time I didn't look back. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Whatever this company was involved in, it was dangerous. I knew I had crossed a line, and the repercussions would come swiftly. As I returned to my desk, Harrington was waiting for me, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. Harrington led me into his office without another word, shutting the door firmly behind us. The room was sparse, with nothing but a desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my pulse thundering in my ears. "You were seen near the restricted area," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Do you know what kind of trouble you're inviting by disregarding company policy?" I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. My mind flashed back to the photographs and the redacted documents. What could I even say? Denying it would be futile. His expression darkened as he took a step closer. "Listen carefully," he continued, his tone turning almost conspiratorial. "This isn't just about you. What you saw, if you were foolish enough to enter, puts everyone here at risk. We have protocols for a reason." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable. I felt the weight of his warning settle over me like a shroud. As I left the office, I noticed coworkers watching me from their desks, their faces impassive yet unnerving. I realized they must have known all along. They were complicit, and now, so was I. Over the following days, the paranoia became unbearable. Everywhere I turned, I felt eyes on me. Coworkers who had once been indifferent now seemed to scrutinize my every move. My desk drawers were rifled through, my belongings subtly rearranged. Someone had even left a slip of paper under my keyboard with a single word scrawled on it: "Stop." At night, the unease followed me home. My phone buzzed with anonymous messages, cryptic warnings to stay quiet and mind my business. Every creak of my apartment floor felt like an intruder. Sleep became a distant memory. Back at work, things only escalated. My computer access was restricted, and tasks were reassigned without explanation. Once, as I walked past the restricted area, I caught a glimpse of someone emerging from the room. Their face was unfamiliar, pale and hollow, like they hadn't slept in weeks. They stopped, staring at me for what felt like an eternity before disappearing down the corridor. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever this company was hiding, it was bigger than me, and I wasn't prepared to pay the price for uncovering it. I began plotting my departure in secret, careful to leave no trace of my intentions. My resignation letter was brief and deliberately vague, citing personal reasons. I timed my exit for the end of the work week, hoping to slip away unnoticed. But the company wasn't going to let me leave that easily. On my last day, Harrington called me into his office once more. His expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed a quiet menace. "I see you've decided to move on," he said. "I trust you understand the importance of discretion. What you saw, or think you saw, stays here. Do we have an understanding?" I nodded, avoiding his gaze. As I packed up my belongings, I felt the weight of every coworker's stare. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the walls themselves were trying to keep me inside. As I walked to my car, I noticed a figure lingering near the parking lot. It was the same pale-faced person I had seen near the restricted area. They didn't approach me, but their presence was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I got in my car and drove away, refusing to look back. The hotel lobby was quiet, the kind of silence that made the hum of fluorescent lights seem louder than they were. I had booked the room last minute, desperate for a place to rest after a grueling day of travel. The receptionist barely looked at me as she slid a key card across the counter. Her expression was neutral, but her movements were mechanical, as though she'd done this 1,000 times without ever truly seeing the people in front of her. "Room 413, she said, her voice clipped and flat. "Elevators are to your left." I nodded, taking the key card and my luggage. The lobby's dim lighting and faded decor gave the hotel a worn, almost tired feel. A faint smell of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air, but it couldn't quite mask the mustiness. As I made my way to the elevator, I glanced back at the receptionist. She was staring at her monitor, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow, as if I'd already been forgotten. The ride up to the fourth floor was uneventful, but the quietness of the building unnerved me. No chatter from other guests, no sound of footsteps. When I reached my room, I slid the key card in and pushed the door open. The room greeted me with a bland, sterile welcome. Beige walls, a small bed with a thin comforter, and a desk with a rickety chair. It wasn't luxurious, but it would do. At least that's what I told myself. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed something was off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the faint smell, something metallic mixed with a hint of mildew, or the slightly stale air, as if the room hadn't been aired out in weeks. I closed the door behind me and set my bag down, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping up my spine. As I unpacked, my attention was drawn to a pair of shoes peeking out from under the bed. They weren't mine. A mismatched pair, one scuffed black loafer and one worn sneaker, both dusty and slightly frayed. My first instinct was to call the front desk, but I hesitated. It seemed like an innocent oversight, a forgotten item from a previous guest. I nudged the shoes further under the bed with my foot, deciding to ignore them. But the unease didn't go away. I found a jacket hanging in the closet, the fabric stiff and torn at the seams. Its pockets were empty, but it carried an odd smell, faintly sour, like sweat mixed with something I couldn't identify. By the time I finished unpacking, the room felt less like a temporary haven and more like a space I didn't belong in. Still, I convinced myself it was all in my head. I was tired, and travel had a way of amplifying irrational thoughts. The discovery of the notes happened purely by accident. While searching for an outlet to charge my phone, I opened the nightstand drawer. Inside, nestled among a Bible and a laminated room service menu, was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was uneven and jagged, as though written in a hurry. It read, "They're always watching." I froze, staring at the words. My rational mind told me it was just a prank, some bored guest leaving behind a spooky message for the next occupant. But the handwriting carried an urgency that unsettled me. I refolded the note and shoved it back into the drawer, trying to push it out of my mind. Later that evening, while sitting at the desk, I noticed another piece of paper tucked under the desk lamp. This one was shorter. Room 418. Don't go there. My hands trembled as I held the note, the weight of its warning sinking in. The connection between the messages and the strange belongings left behind began to form in my mind, though I tried to dismiss it as coincidence. When I looked up at the mirror above the desk, I thought for a split second that I saw movement behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I told myself it was nothing more than nerves. Yet, the sense of being watched grew stronger, making it impossible to relax. Unable to resist my growing curiosity, I began searching the room more thoroughly. Pulling back the comforter on the bed revealed a small, dark stain near the mattress's edge. It was old, dried and faint, but unmistakably blood. My stomach churned as I stepped back, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. I checked the closet again, this time reaching into its shadowy corners. My fingers brushed against something small and hard. I pulled it out, a photograph, folded and creased. It showed a man standing in front of a nondescript wall, his expression neutral. The bottom of the photograph was torn, and in its place, someone had scrawled the word "gone" in red ink. My breathing grew shallow as I continued searching. Beneath the bed, hidden behind the mismatched shoes, I found a plastic bag containing a piece of fabric. It was a scarf, frayed and stained with what looked like dirt, or worse. As I held it, a sharp knock at the door made me jump, nearly dropping the bag. I stood frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I slowly approached, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. When I opened the door, there was nothing but silence. After the incident with the knock, my nerves were shot. I bolted the door, double-checked the latch, and slid a chair under the handle for good measure. Despite these precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. Every creak of the floor, every faint sound from the hallway made me jump. The notes and belongings took on a sinister meaning, as if they were warnings meant just for me. Was it possible the previous occupant had left them? Or worse, had someone deliberately placed them here, knowing I'd find them? I felt like the room itself was alive, a silent conspirator in whatever was happening. When I tried to sleep, the paranoia only worsened. I lay fully dressed on top of the comforter, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Shadows seemed to move in the periphery of my vision, and the faint hum of the air conditioner sounded more like whispers. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway, stopping just outside my door. I got up and checked the peephole. Nothing. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The breaking point came in the middle of the night. I woke suddenly, the room colder than before. My first thought was that the air conditioner had malfunctioned, but as I sat up, I saw something on the bedside table. It was one of the cryptic notes, the one I'd stuffed back into the drawer earlier. But now it was propped upright, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. I hadn't touched that drawer since I found the note. My pulse raced as I stared at the words, "They're always watching." Shaking, I turned on every light in the room and started packing. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I needed to leave. As I zipped my suitcase, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the closet. My hands froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the room. I approached the closet cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The jacket I had seen earlier was gone. In its place was something new. A small, folded piece of paper with a single word scrawled in red ink. "Run." That was it. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door without looking back. The hallway was eerily quiet as I made my way to the elevator, clutching my suitcase like a lifeline. The soft hum of the elevator's descent felt agonizingly slow, each second stretching into eternity. When the doors finally opened, I half expected to see someone, or something, waiting for me in the lobby. But it was empty. The receptionist was still at her desk, her face illuminated by the cold glow of her monitor. She glanced up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Checking out early?" she asked, her tone devoid of any real interest. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something came up. I have to leave." She didn't press me for details, simply tapping a few keys on her computer before handing me a receipt. "Safe travels," she said, her voice flat. As I exited the building, I couldn't help but glance back. Through the large glass windows of the lobby, I thought I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway where my room had been. It was too far away to make out details, but it felt like they were watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I threw my bag into the trunk of my car and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights following me. But the road remained empty. The hum of my car's engine sputtered before cutting off completely, leaving me coasting to a stop on a stretch of isolated road. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as the reality of my situation sank in. No engine noise, no lights on the dashboard, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and the creak of cooling metal. I glanced at my phone, praying for a miracle, but the screen mocked me with a single, damning icon. No service. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at my skin as I popped the hood and stared at the incomprehensible tangle of wires and machinery. I knew as much about car engines as I did about astrophysics. The odds of fixing this myself were zero. Time dragged on as I weighed my options. The road stretched empty in both directions with no sign of another vehicle. Just as I began to wonder if I'd be stuck here all night, I spotted a figure in the distance, a man walking toward me. Relief flooded through me. Help, finally. The man was average in every way, medium build, nondescript clothes, and a face that radiated an easy friendliness. "Car trouble?" he called out as he approached, his voice carrying over the stillness of the road. "Yeah," I replied, stepping back from the engine. "It just died on me. I can't figure out what's wrong." He smiled, the kind of smile meant to disarm. "Let me take a look. I've worked on cars a bit." Without waiting for an invitation, he leaned over the engine, fiddling with wires and muttering to himself. Gratitude mingled with unease as I watched him work. His sudden appearance felt almost too convenient, but I was desperate, and his presence made the empty road feel less lonely. "Thanks for stopping," I said. "I wasn't sure how long I'd be out here." "No problem," he replied, his voice muffled as he reached deeper into the engine. "You're lucky I came along. Not many folks use this road, especially at this time of day." The comment struck me as odd. How would he know how busy this road was? I dismissed the thought, chalking it up to nerves. He was just making conversation. That's all. As he worked, the man began to ask questions. At first, they seemed harmless. Where were you headed, and what kind of car is this? But soon, they became more personal. "You traveling alone?" he asked casually, not looking up from the engine. The question set off a faint alarm in my mind. Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Just visiting a friend." He nodded slowly, as if processing my answer. "Does your friend know you're on your way? You know, in case you don't show up on time?" The words made my stomach tighten. Something about the way he phrased it felt wrong, like he was probing for information he shouldn't need. I forced a smile. "Yeah, they're expecting me. I told them I might be late." For a moment, his hands stilled on the engine. Then he straightened up and wiped his hands on his pants. "Well, this might take a while," he said, his tone still friendly but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "You sure there's no one you can call to come get you?" The man's demeanor began to shift as he stepped back from the car. He was no longer the helpful stranger. Now, he seemed more like someone asserting control. "You know," he said, gesturing toward the road behind him, "there's a gas station a couple of miles back. We could walk there and get some help." His suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. "I think I'll wait here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure someone will come by soon." His smile faltered, just for a second, before returning full force. "Suit yourself," he said, leaning casually against the side of my car. "But it might be a while. Roads like this, you're lucky I even showed up." The way he said lucky sent a shiver down my spine. I realized I had no control over the situation anymore. He was too close, too comfortable, and I was too isolated. I needed to figure out how to get him to leave, or how to leave myself, without making him suspicious. The shift in his demeanor was subtle, but undeniable. He no longer pretended to focus on the car, leaning back casually with his arms crossed. His gaze lingered too long, studying me in a way that made my skin crawl. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "if no one's coming to help you, it's good you've got me here. Don't want to spend all night out here, do you?" I forced a weak laugh, hoping to keep things light. "No, definitely not. I appreciate your help, but I'm sure someone will come by soon." His eyes narrowed slightly, and his smile didn't reach them anymore. "Like I said, this road's pretty quiet. I'd be surprised if anyone else showed up. Besides, it's getting dark." He pointed toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in muted oranges and purples. I felt my throat tighten. "I'm fine waiting," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He stepped closer, too close. "You don't have to wait, you know. I can take you somewhere safe. No one would even have to know you were stuck out here." The words hung in the air, their implication chilling. My heart began to race as I realized how much control he had over the situation. My car was dead, my phone had no service, and I was stranded miles from anyone who could help. The growing darkness only heightened my sense of vulnerability. I needed to get away, but every move felt like it might provoke him further. He stood between me and any chance of escape, his posture relaxed but his intent unmistakable. I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, trying to appear calm. "Maybe you're right," I said, injecting a hint of doubt into my voice. "If no one else comes, I might need a ride after all." He nodded, his expression smug, as if he'd already won. "Smart choice. No point sitting out here all night." I glanced toward my car and acted as though I'd just thought of something. "Let me grab my wallet. It's in the glove compartment." He didn't move as I opened the driver's side door, keeping one foot inside the vehicle as I rummaged through the compartment. My hands shook as I fumbled for the emergency flashlight I knew was stored there. The heavy metal device felt reassuring in my grip. From the corner of my eye, I saw him shift his weight, leaning slightly forward. "Find what you need?" he asked, his voice tinged with impatience. "Yeah," I replied, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Just a second." I seized the moment. Swinging the flashlight with all my strength, I slammed the door shut and bolted to the other side of the car. He stumbled back, startled, and shouted something I couldn't make out. My pulse thundered in my ears as I yanked open the passenger door, scrambling inside and locking the doors. He recovered quickly, pounding on the driver's side window. "Open the door," he yelled, his earlier veneer of friendliness completely gone. His fists hit the glass harder with each word. "You can't stay in there forever!" I jammed the key into the ignition, praying for a miracle. The engine sputtered weakly, the same lifeless sound as before. Panic surged through me. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel, as though sheer desperation could coax the car back to life. He stepped back, his expression cold and calculating. For a moment, I thought he might walk away, but instead, he moved toward the hood of the car. I realized with dawning horror that he was going to try to disable it completely. Just as he reached the front, I turned the key one last time. The engine roared to life with a sound that felt like salvation. Without thinking, I floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward with a shudder. He jumped aside, narrowly avoiding being hit, and I sped down the road without looking back. Even after I put miles between myself and the scene, the fear didn't leave me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, and every shadow on the roadside felt like him, waiting to jump out. I drove until I reached a gas station, the bright fluorescent lights offering a false sense of security. I parked near the entrance and stumbled out of the car, my legs trembling beneath me. The clerk inside stared at me with mild concern as I fumbled for my phone. With service restored, I called a friend and tried to explain what had happened, though my words came out in a frantic jumble.